it seems like we are addicted to the drama of our egos. Let's talk about addiction. Well, there's usually some kind of underlying distress. Let's say somebody's an alcoholic. There's an underlying distress. They use alcohol as a temporary relief. It has consequences, which ends up feeding the underlying distress, and there's a vicious cycle. I think the ego is very similar, is that underneath the ego is an underlying distress. Remember that each type is based on an underlying fear. We have an underlying fear, and the ego is a compensation for the fear. The fear is that sense of separation from our oneness, a fear of lack of safety for ourselves or others, and a feeling of disconnection. And they're kind of interwoven and interrelated, but those are the primary core fears. Each type has a different variation of that fear. So the 8s can feel the fear of just being vulnerable because of that sense of separation. The 9s can feel that fear in terms of feeling just that sense of disconnection from others and oneness. The 1s have that fear of life is flawed. I'm flawed, and I've got to go about correcting it. 2s, the fear is that I don't have value and worth, and I have to help other people. 4, I don't have identity, so I have to be special. I have to be unique in order to have identity. Let's look at what the core pieces of the addiction are. We engage in something to decrease a discomfort. It has long-term consequences. We have difficulty stopping it, and we're usually in denial about it. That's how I define addiction. Engaged in something to decrease a discomfort, has long-term consequences, we have difficulty stopping, and we tend to be in denial about it. So let's talk about that from the ego perspective. At our core of the ego is this fear. So the ego then creates stories to decrease the fear, which is no different than an alcoholic drinking to decrease their discomfort. The ego is coming in to decrease the fear, which is the first sign of an addiction, that we're turning to something to soothe ourselves, to calm some discomfort, which is our core fear. So we have all sorts of dramas and stories that we get into as a way of distracting ourselves from the fear, giving us a sense of strength, giving us a sense of identity, giving us a sense of purpose, and that will overcome the fear is the intention. But it's never enough. No matter how much we do, because we're not addressing the fear directly, we're just doing something to temporarily calm it, all the drama is creating more distress. I think this is why the emptiness can feel very boring and even uncomfortable, because it's removing the drama of the ego that we, all of us, every one of us, is addicted to. We're addicted to our ego. Now let's compound that. Because with all that drama that we go through, now we develop a baseline of arousal that's higher because of all the cortisol and adrenaline that goes through our body with all the drama. Now that feeds the very thing that feeds fear. Fear is based on some arousal in the amygdala and arousal in adrenaline and cortisol and the stress hormones. So the drama of the ego ends up creating and feeding our fear. So that meets the second criteria of addiction, in that it has a negative consequence. It's something we engage in as a temporary relief, but it has long-term consequences because it's feeding the fear. So then, if that doesn't do it, then we want to then attach to other people. So then we have an attachment to other people for our well-being, which is natural. But what happens is that we get all sorts of codependency that's going on, and oxytocin that gets activated, and dopamine that gets activated in the seeking of somebody else to be there for us, with us. We're activating our whole arousal system with our coping of the ego. The ego ends up activating our arousal system that the ego is trying to compensate for. This becomes our identity, becomes our way of being. Is all the stories, all the identity associated with the ego. Which then makes it all the more difficult to stop because it's our identity. So that's the third step of an addiction, is that it's difficult to stop. So when our coping strategy, the ego, is so prominent, and that becomes our sense of self and our sense of identity, it's hard to transform the ego and let it go, because it's all we take ourselves to be. Which is why you keep hearing me talk about you are an expression of the universe. You are a vibratory nature of the universe to help you make this transition, this transformation from identifying as the ego, that you are so much more than that. You are an expression beyond your wildest dreams. But we limit ourselves. And then we don't even see it. We don't see that we're addicted to our own ego. So then we're in denial, which is the fourth step of an addiction, is in denial. And then, of course, we want other people to join us in our addiction. And they do willingly. So we have this underlying fear that we ignore, try to compensate for it through our ego, which ends up creating more arousal and disappointment and frustration, which then magnifies the fear of sense of aloneness and separation and vulnerability, which increases all of the egoic defenses. And we're caught in an addiction cycle.